God is Red, Chapter 15. The Aboriginal World and Christian History. Had the world been a three-story finite universe, the Christian doctrine of history might have maintained itself and been a valid consideration of modern people. The simple story of humankind growing out of the Garden of Eden and populating the world might have been sufficient for all people in their own times. And the world did not remain as the early prophets conceived it. By 300 BC, Alexander the Great had shown the Near Eastern peoples the wonders of India. Explorations by Europeans over a 1,000-year period indicated that the globe was much larger than the writer of Genesis had figured. Columbus demonstrated that it was indeed a globe. The trauma of discovery of the New World for the Christian theologians was immense. It had not yet been adequately understood by them. What were devout thinkers to make of the existence of millions of people living on lands larger than Europe? What was their status with respect to Christianity, the one true religion? Did God have a purpose for these people? Could Jesus return until all of these nations had been preached the gospel? What was the responsibility of God's chosen nations in the face of this revelation of the tremendous scope of humankind? The reaction of the Christian nations to the discovery of the New World and its potential riches was one of unmitigated greed. Having been repulsed by the Muslims in their efforts to subjugate the Near East, and nearly prostrated after the wars to establish the divine right monarchies, the kings of Europe badly needed an inexhaustible source of income to maintain themselves. Visualizing a steady stream of wealth from the Indies, which would allow them to avoid giving political rights and economic benefits to the rising commercial classes in return for financial support to the crown. The heads of the European states saw in the New World the only hope of maintaining themselves. The Christian Church was also eager to exploit the new lands, its political power beginning to wane with the rise of strong European political leaders. The Christian Church saw a means of directing the invasion of the new lands by placing its imprimatur on exploitation. In effect, taking a percentage of the loot in return for blessing the enterprise. In 1493, Pope Alexander the 11th, or the 6th, yeah, the 6th, issued his Intercatura bull, which laid down the basic Christian attitude toward the New World, among other works well pleasing to the divine majesty and cherished of our heart. This assuredly ranks highest, that in our times, especially the Catholic faith and the Christian religion, be exalted and everywhere increased and spread, that the health of souls be cared for, and that barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the faith itself. What this pious language meant in practical terms was that if confiscation of lands were couched in quasi-religious sentiments, the nations of Europe could proceed. In an immensely practical gesture, the Pope noted that he did thereby give, grant, and assign forever to you and your heirs and successors, kings of Castile and Leon, all singular, the aforesaid countries and islands, hitherto discovered and to be discovered, together with all their dominions, cities, camps, places, and villages, and all rights, jurisdictions, and appurtenances of the same. The lands and villages were not, of course, the Pope's to give, unless the understanding of the universe, history, and the planet promulgated by Christianity were correct. If such were the case, then it would have followed that, the entire planet being a franchise of the Holy Father, he could distribute it to whomever he found in need of rewarding. regardless of the later totally secular exploitations of the native peoples conducted by the secular governments of Europe. This papal bull of 1493 marked the official attitude of Christianity toward peoples it had not previously thought to exist. The controversy over the place of the newly discovered natives continued to rage. However, as more information on the New World was made available to the people of Europe, the Treaty of Tordesillas in the following year divided South America neatly between Spain and Portugal, allowing each primacy over portions of the continent that neither had explored or conquered. Plainly, the Pope was supervising not the divinely ordered division of the world's lands, but the national hunting licenses for rape and pillage. The status of native peoples around the globe was firmly cemented by the intervention of Christianity into the political affairs of exploration and colonization. They were regarded as not having ownership of their lands, but as merely existing on them at the pleasure of the Christian God who had now given them to the nations of Europe. Upon encountering a tribe or nation of native peoples, the Spanish used to read their requirement, which basically recited the Christian interpretation of history, beginning with the Garden of Eden and ending with the Pope enthroned in Rome. The natives were then asked to pledge their allegiance to the Pope and the King of Spain, and failing to surrender to Christianity and the expanding Spanish Empire meant that it was then legal and an act of religious piety for the Europeans to wage war to wrest their lands from the people. Again, the use of Christian doctrines served to justify the actions of the Christian nations. For centuries, Christian theologians debated the conception of the nature of the just war, in much the same manner as Protestant theologians used to debate the morality of killing people trying to get in your home bomb shelter during an atomic attack back in the days when America was paranoid over Russian missile attacks. The natives, refusing to accept the gospel, were thus made subjects of the just Christian war because they had refused to accept the truth that had been revealed some 1500 years before. As exploration and colonization continued, the debate expanded about the native peoples and their rights. The only available philosophical system purporting to explain the world of daily events was that of Aristotle, who had once divided mankind into men and slaves. The anti-Indian theologians relied heavily upon Aristotelian thinking to support their thesis that natives could be enslaved. Even pro-native theologians admitted that the natives should be subjected to force until they were converted to the true faith. In 1526, Francisco de Vitoria at Salamanca attacked the use of Aristotle to deny Indians of the New World their rights to property and liberty. Vitoria denied the right of the Christians to convert the natives forcibly because he was aware of the mistreatment that had been the lot of the natives resisting conversion. But he then justified conquest of the natives and their lands on the basis of Christian trade rights, finding that God had intended all nations to trade with one another. Any nation or group that prevented trade could then be conquered, so that uninhibited trade might continue. Preventative conquest to protect commercial rights became the basis on which the Spanish and Portuguese made complete their mastery of the new lands and their peoples. By 1550, two camps of theologians had developed, each with its own version of the legal and theological status of the peoples of the New World. Each theory, incidentally, led to justifying the exploitation and conquest. Father Bartolome de las Casas took the side of the natives, while Juan de Sepulveda took the opposing view and justified extinction and enslavement. Las Casas interpreted the Christian position and the 1493 papal bull as giving a right to Spain only to preach the Christian doctrine peaceably. The natives' existing property rights were to be recognized. Sepulveda, a rigorous Aristotelian philosopher, simply classified the natives as among those who had been meant to be subjugated. Their opposition to Spanish enslavement was thus morally wrong because it violated the purpose for which God had intended the natives. For Sepulveda, pure Christian chauvinism was the answer to the problems of the Old World meeting the New World. While he did not totally win the debate, his views were eagerly accepted by those Europeans going to the New World, thus winning his point in fact in what came after him. And by the time the other European nations got into the business of discovering lands and peoples in the Western Hemisphere, the struggle for recognition of native legal rights had, for all practical purposes, vanished. The European nations were more concerned with their wars for control of distant lands than acknowledging the rights of the peoples over whom they asserted control. The doctrine that the Pope had been given total control over the planet by God was soon secularized into justification for European nations, definitively Christian, to conquer and subdue the peoples of the lands that they entered. And once the doctrine became secularized, it was impossible for anyone to question its validity. Its impact was obvious, and the result were satisfactory to European political heads of state. Gradually, then, the colonizing European powers began to define their rights with respect to other nations of non-Christian peoples. The natives had rights to occupy the lands on which they had traditionally lived until such time as those lands were needed by the invading Europeans. And at that time, the European nation could extinguish the natives' title by purchase or conquest. And with respect to each other, the European nations accepted the claims of the nation that first explored new lands and had sufficient military power to protect its claim. And with respect to the natives who happened to occupy the lands, they were completely at the mercy of the acquisitive Christian nation. The wars for control of the North American continent saw the claims of the various European nations dwindle as England consistently defeated the other nations and succeeded to their claims when each nation gave up its territory on the continent as part of the peace terms. While European wars raged among England, France, Spain, Holland, and other countries, the natives' legal rights were bounced back and forth as concessions were made in wars that had little to do with the people of the continent. England had no sooner achieved dominance in North America than the English colonists revolted against the mother country. Aided by France, which was still smarting over the defeat handed them by England a decade before, they succeeded in freeing themselves from English control. Almost the first claim put forth by the new nation after the successful break with England was that the colonies had succeeded to the claims made by the mother country under the doctrine of discovery. The United States was therefore under no obligation to deal justly with the continent's tribes. Rather, it stood well within the tradition of Christian nations that had previously looted Central and South America and were then in the process of conquering India and Africa. The basic legal policy of the U.S. government became one of tentative recognition of the Indian interest in the land combined with the assertion that the lands could be taken from the people at any time they were needed by the federal government. The first articulation of the Christian attitude toward the native peoples and their rights came in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, in which the U.S. Congress proclaimed that it would never take the Indian lands except in just wars. And as it turned out, there were no just wars, and the lands were systematically taken. And after a century of conflict and systematic oppression, the tribes were lucky to survive with a fragment of their former homelands as reservations for those who had not been killed. The story is not simply that of the American Indians, however, because the history of Christian nations around the globe has been less than religious. England and France fought titanic struggles for control of the Indian subcontinent, for parts of Africa, and for trade rights in North Africa and Asia. As late as World War I, Nations were being given to dominant European nations as League of Nations mandates and protectorates. Colonialism has still not vanished. It now shows itself as the American political crusade for a new world order or as the operational results of the giant supranational corporations of Western peoples. Western corporate imperialism so dominates the world scene, it is easy to overlook Japan's taking sovereignty over a few islands. When Canada and Australia achieved independence from the British Crown, they allegedly stepped into the shoes of Queen Elizabeth II, insofar as the natives of the lands were concerned. The Queen had been the trustee for Indian lands in Canada, and a substantial portion of the Canadian lands had been held by the Queen on behalf of the native Indian tribes. And after the British North American Act, Canada refused to accept its responsibilities with respect to native land rights. Today, the Canadian government still refuses to recognize the land titles of the Canadian Indian tribes. Thus, even the veneer of protection that Aboriginal title has given to natives of the United States has been denied to Canadian Indians. The Aborigines of Australia are in worse shape because they are by definition without rights. They cannot enter the courts of that land to defend their rights to lands on which they have lived for thousands of years. Australia claims a legal right to the lands of the continent as derived from Great Britain, while denying the Australian Aborigines the right to demand from the Australian government the protection in land occupancy such as derived title implies. The South American countries make no bones about exterminating their Indians. Brazil has carried on systematic genocide against the interior native tribes for many years. The atrocities committed against these people have been well documented by numerous groups and promptly denied by Brazilian officials. Not the slightest pretense has been made that the natives could have any rights to land. They are simply moved or killed whenever land is needed by the Brazilian government. Almost all of the South American nations are predominantly Catholic and reflect the same attitude once promulgated by Sepulveda. Some people are meant to be slaves, and it is immoral for them to resist enslavement. Even smaller nations that should have lands and rights protected have been denied any voice in the matter. Sweden moved into Lapland some centuries ago, and now denies that the Lapps may have any rights in their own land. In a situation similar to Canada, changes in Swedish national law and status have erased any mention of the rights and property that the Lapps may have had. At present, the Swedish government is busy finishing the cultural genocide of the Lapp, or same people, through the travesty of court procedures that have already been arranged to divest the Lapps or any rights to their lands and national status. The final arena of degradation is what is now known as the Trust Territories of the Pacific. And during the period before World War II, Japan fortified those islands received as protectorates following World War I. As World War II got underway, the American forces invaded many of the islands Japan had occupied, and many Japan had not occupied. And as the war progressed, a substantial number of peaceful islands got in the way of the two superpowers and were taken by one side or the other. The peaceful Pacific was soon divided between the United States and Japan. And after the Japanese surrender, all the islands came under what may be euphemistically called a U.S. trust. That is to say, the United States now holds the islands and will continue to do so until it feels like disposing of them. Little effort has been made to give the islands political freedom, and they are now being prepared for large excursions of affluent American tourists. The peaceful Pacific will shortly be America's vacation land, and its people will be servants to rich vacationing Americans. They will never receive even the degree of independence they enjoyed prior to World War II. Even worse, their lives are administered by the Department of Interior. a bureaucracy hopelessly inept and unconcerned. The responsibility of Christianity for this state of affairs must certainly be heavy, and without the initial Christian doctrines giving Europeans free rein over the rest of the world, much of the exploitation would not have occurred. It was only when people were able to combine Western greed with religious fanaticism that the type and extent of exploitation that history has recorded was made possible. And even today, the Christian missionaries search the jungles of the Amazon looking for Indian tribes to convert. And in their wake come the professional killers to exterminate the tribes, and following them, the government bureaucracies, road builders, and land developers to subdue the lands of the interior for world commerce. And in almost every generation, the trade and in almost every generation, trade and conversion for religious purposes have gone hand in hand to destroy nations of the world on behalf of Western commercial interests in Christianity. And where the cross goes, there is never life more abundantly, only death, and destruction, and ultimately betrayal. And among all the nations of the world, the United States has created the best record in dealing with Aboriginal peoples. The checks and balances of the American political system and the secular concern for justice have slowed the rate of exploitation of American Indians, so that for many tribes, at least a portion of legal status exists. The United States, for example, is the only nation to establish a claims commission to attempt to rectify treaty wrongs with the native inhabitants. Canada refuses to discuss such a commission. Australia loathes the suggestion. Average Christians, when hearing of the disasters wreaked on Aboriginal peoples by their religion and its adherents, are quick to state, but the people who did this were not really Christians. In point of fact, they really were Christians. In their day, they enjoyed all the benefits and prestige Christendom could confer. They were cheered as heroes of the faith, enduring hardships that a Christian society might be built on the ruins of pagan villages. They were featured in Sunday school lessons as saints of the Christian church. Cities, rivers, mountains, and seas were named after them. And if the exploiters of old were not Christians, why did not the true Christians rise up in defiance of the derogation of the religious heritage and faith? If the Prime Minister of Canada is today not Christian in his attitudes toward the Indians of Canada, where are the Christians in Canada who prophetically denounced his actions? And if the leaders of the Brazilian government do not exercise Christian values, where are the Christians to disclaim their actions? And if exploitation of the Amazon for commercial purposes by American investors results in the unchristian activity of poisoning thousands of Indians, why are not the true Christians demanding the resignations of the heads of American corporations supporting Amazon development? And at this point in the clash between Western industrialism and the planet's Aboriginal peoples, we find little or no voice coming from the true Christians to prevent continued exploitation. Instead, we find rhetorical assertions that the Christian God is controlling history and fulfilling his divine plan for all humankind. And in the face of world events, this assertion is fraudulent at best, an insult to the intelligence of humankind at worst. It is time to call a halt to the unchallenged assumptions of the Christian conception of history. This conception is even breaking apart in the national strongholds of Christianity. And the various tribal peoples of Europe that were bludgeoned into accepting supranationalism a century or more ago are flexing their muscles in resistance to continued oppression. The Irish, Welsh, and Celts are demanding freedom. In France, the Bretons have a national movement. The Flemish are reviving their ancient customs. Italy is a virtual conglomerate rebelling at the continued supremacy of the national government. And as we watch the Iron Curtain countries experience a general collapse of their economy and political institutions, the long submerged ethnic minorities have begun to assert themselves once again. Even the horrific bloodshed in Serbia and Croatia testifies to the inability of the nation state to deal realistically with ethnicity. Not only is Christian history at an end, but quite possibly the end is in sight for its secular expansion, the manifest destiny of Europeans to rule the world. The first step in this process of restitution should not be recitals by sincere followers of the Christian religion, admitting their guilt for past wrongs. For example, we have already seen a multitude of tears fall over the demise of D. Brown's Indians without a corresponding change in attitude or treatment of American Indians. Further confession of sins is useless and avoids the central question of history. Why must men repeat past mistakes? Being guilty for remote sins is easy. Accepting responsibilities for current and future sins is difficult. It is this contemporary attitude toward Aboriginal peoples that must be changed, rather than compensation for past wrongs. Christians must disclaim the use of history as a weapon of conquest today. And in doing so, they must support the fight of the Aboriginal peoples wherever it exists. They must demand a new status for Native peoples around the planet. They must demand protection of natives and of their lands, cultures, and religions. They must honestly face the problems of Western societies and consider what real alternatives now exist for those societies to survive in a world that is growing smaller. A world that must contain a great number of smaller groups whose existence is guaranteed and whose rights are not to be trampled underfoot. The justification of past exploitations of native peoples has been that the gospel had to be preached to them and that a newer and better civilization had to rise from the native people's primitive hovels. Such a gospel of peace has been notoriously lacking as an element in Western civilization, and it is very questionable whether the present state of decay, corruption, and exploitation is better than what had existed before the coming of the Western Christian to the nations of the world. And when ecologists find a predictable lifespan of a generation separating us from total extinction, it would seem that we have a duty to search for another interpretation of humankind's life story, instead of the traditional Christian view of the world and what it means. And unless we solve some of our problems, God will have to intervene to save any of us. The present state of affairs cannot conceivably be justified. It cannot be justified, at least religiously. And one must conclude that in Christianity, humankind has at its best been deluded. While the religion appeared to give comfort and solace to people in all ages, its resultant impact on the world as a whole has been anything but comforting. It has been used by its followers to justify their most dastardly deeds, and it has focused our concern on the life hereafter, so that we have refused to believe what our experiences tell us is true. We must now undertake to find a more profound explanation of ourselves and the planet on which we live. Already, in our secular society, we are finding indications that, given a degree of concern for the land, people, and solving problems, changes can be made in our understanding of the world. We now recognize that the command of Genesis is not to be taken literally. We simply cannot continue to be fruitful and multiply without destroying everything. We need some relevant form of birth control. 2 decades ago, the legal status of abortion was changed, and for a brief time we had some relief from the medieval conception of women as breeding stock. But the response of conservative Protestant and Roman Catholic Christians was anything but heartening. They promptly reformed an aggressive and highly vocal political pressure group to seek reversal of the Roe v. Wade decision. And with the recent appointment to the Supreme Court of determined anti abortion justices by Ronald Reagan and George Bush, this decision will soon be reversed. We will continue to see millions of children ushered into a life of starvation, sexual abuse, and meaninglessness. And for some unknown reason, this branch of Christianity cherishes the unborn and hates the living person. We have also seen the death penalty become a political controversy. First, the Supreme Court declares its cruel and unusual punishment and then modifies its prohibition. We are now faced with the responsibility of acting as a mature society in relation to those who defy our laws. While a substantial number of Christians supported the abolition of the death penalty, an even greater number opposed abolition on biblical grounds. The fact that each justice of the Supreme Court has felt it necessary to outline his or her own position on the subject indicates that we are not far enough over the threshold of barbarity. No sooner had the first Supreme Court decision been announced than the nation's conservatives rose up to find ways to overcome the decision. In California, a referendum was placed on the ballot in 1972 and was passed into law. It required the death penalty on a mandatory basis for a specific list of crimes, thereby circumventing the reasoning of the justices. In recent years, Congress has considered forms of compensation for victims of violent crimes. This development is a return to an old Anglo-Saxon law and finds its natural roots in the beliefs of tribal religions. The reward for suffering in Christianity has always been in heaven, and the idea that a society has a responsibility to compensate those whom it failed to protect has not been a major value of Christian nations. Such a societal conception has always dominated Indian tribal groups. And beyond that, however, the idea of social compensation means that we have taken a major step in the conceptualization of America as a society with a potential for integrity. It is, perhaps, the most important aspect of the problem. In recent years, Congress has considered forms of compensation for victims of violent crimes. On almost every front, therefore, we find the old mythologies of Christianity being intellectually and often emotionally rejected by contemporary society. The rejection is not always for the better. Jumping from Christianity to devil worship can hardly be called an improvement. But the willingness to explore the unknown forces in our spiritual frontier can be called an improvement. We cannot reject the Christian religion piecemeal. The importance of the decline of the specific doctrines of the Christian religion is that this decline means that the whole religion has been misdirected from its inception. It arose out of a Near Eastern milieu in which control of populations was the important value, and in its institutions it had continually sought to exercise control over the beliefs, values, and behaviors of large masses of people. Merely canceling the belief in the Christian afterlife does not free us from the necessity of finding out the nature of that life, if such exists. Rejecting the Christian interpretation of creation means a responsibility to find a better conception of a religion as it relates to creation, or creation as it testifies to religion or religious experiences. Having changed and rejected Christian interpretations of many human experiences, we must in our generation reject the concept of history as an inevitable and controlled or controllable process. Our adventure in Vietnam should surely testify to the fact that we cannot control history, and that what appears inevitable is only a projection of our wishes, not a future event. We need to take a new look at what the human experiences have been, and from our best conclusions begin to describe what we feel the whole nature of historical existence on the planet has meant. Stabilizing societies so that further societal exploitation cannot exist is the first step in determining a new idea of history for humankind. The planet was not given to the Pope, and his subsequent divisions of it to his favorite European sovereigns may have ultimately been illegal in the most fundamental sense of the term. Present unhampered exploitation of the lands and peoples of the world by post-Christian supranational corporations may have been the logical result of Western history, but that does not have to be its final result. Christianity itself may find the strength to survive if honestly faces the necessity to surrender its narrow interpretation of history and embark on a determined search for the true meaning of human life on this planet. Even surrendering a belief in a God who exercises supremacy over world events becomes possible. In surrendering the belief, one comes to a greater understanding of the nature of religion and religious experiences. For a divinity, if indeed one exists, cannot be bound in doctrines and beliefs in any ultimate sense. To restrict one's God, then, to a particular mode of operation and sequence of appearance would seem to be irreligious and the utmost folly. End of chapter 15. God is red.